He found an injured wild horse in the snow, and she did the impossible to save his life. Dakota wasn't like other Mustangs that roam the rugged terrain of Montana's Blackfoot Valley. Her distinctive white blaze, shaped like a lightning bolt down her face, matched the fierce determination in her amber eyes. At 12 years old, she had earned a reputation among local ranchers as the ghost mare, not for her dappled gray coat that seemed to shimmer in the moonlight, but for her uncanny ability to appear and disappear in the vast wilderness, eluding every attempt at capture. What the ranchers didn't know was that Dakota's elusiveness stemmed from a traumatic past. 6 years earlier, she had witnessed her entire herd rounded up in a brutal capture operation, barely escaping herself. The memory of thundering helicopters and the panic in her herdmate's eyes had taught her to trust only the wilderness itself. Since then, she had survived alone, mastering the harsh realities of the mountain landscape through wit and instinct. But now, everything had changed. The solitary life she had chosen was transformed by the arrival of her foal, Echo. Born just 3 days ago during the onset of an unseasonably early winter, the colt's midnight black coat stood in stark contrast to his mother's silvery grace. His only marking, a perfect mirror image of Dakota's lightning blaze, seemed to mark him as something special from the moment he took his first breath. Jack Morrison, the lone rancher who would soon become entangled in their story, had his own reasons for choosing solitude. After losing his wife Sarah in a riding accident 2 years ago, he had retreated to his family's remote cabin, taking only emergency veterinary calls and avoiding the sympathetic glances of townspeople who knew his story. His cabin, perched on the edge of Whitefish Lake, served as both sanctuary and prison, a place where he could nurse his grief while still maintaining some connection to the work that had once given his life meaning. As the season's first major storm system approached, none of them, a mare, foal, or rancher, could have predicted how their paths would cross. The Weather Service had warned of a historic blizzard, but even their dire predictions would prove inadequate for what was coming. In the gathering darkness of that fateful evening, as the first heavy snowflakes began to fall, nature was about to test the limits of survival, courage, and the unbreakable bond between a mother and her child. The storm descended upon the valley with unprecedented fury. What began as gentle snowfall quickly transformed into a blinding white curtain, driven horizontal by winds that howled through the pine trees like hungry wolves. Dakota had led Echo to what she thought was a sheltered area near Whitefish Lake, using her body to shield her young foal from the worst of the elements. The temperature plummeted rapidly, turning the light powder into sheets of ice that coated everything they touched. Dakota's instinct screamed at her to move away from the lake. Echo, still unsteady on his legs and exhausted from fighting the wind, needed rest. She nudged him closer to a cluster of evergreens, their branches offering minimal protection from the relentless storm. As darkness fell, the situation grew dire. The wind changed direction suddenly, driving them from their temporary shelter. Echo stumbled forward, his small body trembling from cold and exhaustion. Dakota's keen ears picked up an ominous sound beneath her foal's hooves, the subtle cracking of ice that had been hidden beneath the fresh snow. Before she could react, the surface gave way. Echo's terrified whinny pierced the howling wind as he plunged through the ice into the black water below. Dakota lunged forward instinctively, but the ice cracked further under her weight, forcing her to rear back. Her foal's head bobbed above the surface, his eyes wide with panic as he struggled to keep afloat in the freezing water. Time seemed to stop as Dakota paced the edge of the broken ice, her maternal instincts warring with the reality that any attempt to reach her foal could send them both to their deaths. Echo's movements grew weaker, his efforts to stay above water becoming increasingly desperate. His soft whimpers tore at Dakota's heart as she watched helplessly, pawing at the ice in frustration. It was at this moment that Jack Morrison's flashlight beam cut through the darkness. He had been securing his generator when he heard the commotion on the lake. Years of experience working with horses told him immediately what he was seeing and what would happen if he didn't act fast. "Easy, girl," he called out to Dakota, his voice barely audible over the wind. He approached slowly, knowing that one wrong move could send the panicked mare charging at him or, worse, onto the weakened ice. Dakota's ears flicked toward his voice, but her eyes never left her struggling foal. Jack assessed the situation quickly. The foal was about 20 feet from the shore, in water deep enough to drown but close enough that there might be a chance if he acted immediately. He shrugged off his heavy coat, keeping his movements deliberate and calm despite the urgency pounding in his chest. I know you don't trust humans, he spoke to Dakota, maintaining a steady tone even as his mind raced through possible rescue scenarios. But right now, I'm your baby's only chance, as if understanding the gravity of the situation. Dakota did something extraordinary. She stepped aside, creating a path between Jack and her drowning foal. Their eyes met briefly, and in that moment, Jack saw something that would haunt him forever. The raw and desperate plea of a mother willing to trust her ancient enemy to save her child. There was no time to marvel at this unprecedented display of trust. Echo's struggles were weakening, his small head barely staying above water. Jack grabbed a length of rope from his belt. He never went anywhere without it and began moving toward the broken ice. The wind cut through his clothes like knives, but he barely felt it. All his focus was on the dying foal and the narrow window of opportunity he had to save it. Behind him, Dakota's soft nicker seemed to encourage her foal to hold on just a little longer, as Jack carefully tested his weight on the ice. He silently prayed that the trust this wild mare had just placed in him wouldn't prove to be a fatal mistake. The next few moments revealed truths about both man and beast that would forever change them. As Jack inched his way across the creaking ice, he discovered something that sent a chill through him far colder than the bitter wind. The ice wasn't just breaking in one spot. Spiderweb cracks were spreading outward from Echo's struggle, creating a deadly network that threatened to collapse at any moment. But it was Dakota's behavior that truly astonished him. Instead of panicking or fleeing, the wild mare began methodically stamping her hooves in a distinct pattern along the shoreline. Jack's years of veterinary experience hadn't prepared him for what he was witnessing. She was testing the ice's thickness, creating a map of safe spots through her careful percussion. "You're showing me the path," he whispered, the realization striking him with the force of a physical blow. The mare's intelligence wasn't just remarkable, it was their only chance at survival. Following her cues, Jack adjusted his route, noting how the ice's resonance changed exactly where Dakota had indicated. Through the swirling snow, Jack caught glimpses of Echo's face that brought back memories he tried so hard to suppress. The foal's desperate struggle reminded him of that terrible day 2 years ago, when he'd arrived too late to save Sarah after her riding accident. The same helplessness threatened to overwhelm him now, but Dakota's steady presence anchored him to the present. The mare's behavior revealed something else, a depth of maternal instinct that transcended mere survival. Each time Echo's head dipped below the surface, Dakota would whinny in a specific tone that brought him back up, encouraging him to fight just a little longer. It was communication in its purest form, a mother's love translated into sound and will. Jack's medical training kicked in as he observed Echo's responses becoming slower, more erratic. The foal was entering the dangerous stages of hypothermia, where the body begins to shut down non-essential functions. But in those weakening movements, Jack saw something that gave him hope. The foal was instinctively trying to position himself toward his mother's voice, even in his semi-conscious state. The most startling revelation came when Jack finally got close enough to attempt the rescue. Dakota, reading the situation with uncanny precision, began creating a diversion on the opposite side of the break. Her movements, carefully calculated to draw Echo's attention without further compromising the ice, showed a level of strategic thinking that challenged everything Jack thought he knew about wild horses. As he prepared to make his move, Jack realized that this wasn't just about saving a foal anymore. This was about redemption for his failure to save Sarah, for his self-imposed exile, for every time he'd chosen to turn away from life rather than embrace its challenges. In Dakota's unwavering trust and Echo's fight for survival, he saw a chance to prove that sometimes, just sometimes, you can change the ending to a tragic story. The wind howled louder, the temperature dropped further, and somewhere in the distance, a new threat announced itself with a low, rumbling growl. But in that moment of clarity, as man, mare, and nature converged on a dying foal, Jack understood that the real revelation wasn't about survival at all. It was about the extraordinary lengths we'll go to when love demands more than we think we have to give. Jack had seconds to make a decision that could cost 3 lives. The ice beneath him groaned ominously as he lay flat, distributing his weight while inching closer to Echo. The foal's movements had become dangerously sluggish, his small body barely keeping above the freezing water. Traditional rescue methods wouldn't work here. The rope alone wouldn't be enough, and any sudden movement could shatter what remained of the ice. Drawing on years of experience and pure instinct, Jack made a calculated but dangerous choice. Instead of trying to pull Echo out directly, he would need to slide into the water himself. The shock of the cold hit him like thousands of needles as he lowered himself in, his muscles threatening to seize immediately. The water was so cold it burned, stealing his breath and clouding his thoughts. "Stay with me, little one," he gasped, fighting through the pain as he maneuvered toward Echo. The foal's eyes were glazing over, his survival instinct the only thing keeping him moving. Jack managed to get one arm under the colt's chest, but the added weight threatened to drag them both under. That's when Dakota made a decision of her own. The mare, watching intently from the shore, suddenly moved onto the ice with deliberate, measured steps. The surface crackled beneath her hooves, but she seemed to know exactly where to place each foot. She was creating a counterweight, her presence helping to stabilize the broken ice sheet. It was incredibly risky. One wrong step and all three of them would be trapped under the ice. Jack's medical training screamed at him about the dangers of extended exposure to freezing water. He had perhaps 2 minutes before hypothermia would begin to impair his judgment, and maybe 5 before his muscles would stop responding altogether. The weight of his waterlogged clothes pulled at him as he struggled to keep both himself and Echo afloat. But the consequences of his decision reached far beyond the immediate physical dangers. As he fought to save the foal, memories of Sarah flooded back, memories he'd locked away for 2 years. The helplessness he'd felt then transformed into desperate determination. Now, he couldn't fail again. He wouldn't. Dakota's presence on the ice had created an unexpected advantage. The pressure from her weight caused the broken ice sheet to tilt slightly, creating a natural ramp. Jack seized the opportunity, pushing Echo toward the angled surface. The foal's wet coat was slick, making it nearly impossible to get a firm grip. But Dakota began making soft nickering sounds that seemed to give her baby renewed strength. The consequences of failure loomed large. If Echo died, Jack knew Dakota would likely never trust humans again. The mare's extraordinary display of intelligence and trust would be rewarded with only more trauma. And for Jack himself, losing another life he was responsible for would probably be the final push into complete isolation. Just as he managed to get Echo's front legs onto the ice, a new sound cut through the howling wind, the distinct growl of a predator. The bear they'd heard earlier had drawn closer, attracted perhaps by the commotion. Dakota's ears pivoted toward the threat, but remarkably, she held her position on the ice. She was choosing to trust Jack with her foal's life while facing down a new danger. The next few moments would define all of their fates. Jack's muscles screamed in protest as he gathered his remaining strength for one final push. The ice creaked and shifted, threatening to break apart completely. Dakota maintained her precise position, creating the delicate balance that was keeping them all alive. And Echo, responding to his mother's encouraging calls, found one last burst of energy. With a surge of desperate strength, Jack heaved the foal onto the more solid ice. The effort nearly pulled him under, and for a terrifying moment, he thought he wouldn't be able to pull himself out. His fingers had lost almost all feeling, and the edge of the ice kept breaking away as he tried to grip it. That's when Dakota did something that would later make Jack question everything he thought he knew about wild horses, still maintaining her careful balance on the ice. She stretched her neck out toward him, offering her mane like a rope. The gesture was so deliberate, so intelligent, that Jack would later wonder if he had imagined it in his hypothermic state. But in that moment, survival instinct overrode disbelief. He grabbed the coarse hair, and Dakota slowly, steadily, helped pull him from the water's grasp. The ice held barely as Jack crawled to safety, his body shaking uncontrollably from cold and exhaustion. They had survived the immediate crisis, but they were far from safe. The bear was getting closer, the storm was intensifying, and both Jack and Echo were now in serious danger of freezing to death. The consequences of Jack's decision to attempt the rescue were still unfolding, and the night was far from over. As Jack struggled to his feet, the bear's growls grew more distinct through the storm. But this wasn't the only threat emerging from the darkness. The temperature continued to plummet, and the wind carried an ominous new sound, the cracking of trees under the weight of accumulating ice. They were caught between multiple dangers, with Jack's cabin their only hope for survival. The secondary story of the bear revealed itself as Jack's flashlight beam caught glimpses of movement through the trees. It wasn't just any bear, it was the notorious three-legged grizzly locals called tripod, known for being particularly aggressive due to an old injury that made hunting normal prey difficult. The bear had been forced down from the higher elevations by the early storm, bringing its desperate hunger to the lakeside. Dakota's behavior shifted subtly as she recognized the predator. Her ears flattened, and she positioned herself between the threat and her foe. But there was intelligence in her defensive stance. She wasn't just reacting on instinct, she was calculating. Jack noticed how she kept glancing between the bear's location and the path to his cabin, as if mapping out an escape route. Meanwhile, Echo's condition was deteriorating rapidly. The foal lay shivering on the ice, his wet coat beginning to freeze in the bitter wind. Jack's veterinary training told him they had minutes, not hours, to get the colt warm and dry. His own condition wasn't much better. His clothes were freezing solid, and he could barely feel his extremities. A parallel drama was unfolding in the forest around them. The storm had driven other wildlife into their vicinity, creating an unusual congregation of forest inhabitants. Jack spotted deer huddled under the denser pines, coyotes seeking shelter in the undergrowth, and even a mountain lion crouched low in a tree, all traditional enemies brought together by their common need to survive the unprecedented storm. This forced proximity of predator and prey added another layer of tension to their situation. The bear wasn't just a threat to them. It was a catalyst that could trigger a chain reaction among the gathered wildlife. One panic-induced stampede could prove fatal for Echo in his weakened state. Jack's relationship with his cabin took on new significance. What had been a shelter of isolation, a place to hide from his grief, now needed to become a sanctuary for others. The irony wasn't lost on him. His self-imposed exile might be the only thing that could save these wild creatures tonight. The wind shifted again, bringing with it the distinct crack of a large tree giving way somewhere in the darkness. They were running out of options. Jack's cabin was about 200 yards away, but it might as well have been miles given Echo's condition and the gauntlet they would have to run to reach it. A strange parallel emerged between Jack and Dakota's situations. Both had chosen solitude as a response to trauma. Both were now forced to trust another species to ensure survival. And both were facing a moment where their past choices collided with present necessities. The bear's presence wasn't just a threat, it was a catalyst forcing them to confront their isolated exist and cs. As if understanding the gravity of their situation. Dakota made a soft nickering sound that seemed to carry both determination and inquiry. She was ready to move, but she was waiting for Jack's lead. The question was, could a man who had spent 2 years avoiding connection step up to orchestrate their survival? The dynamic between Jack and Dakota shifted in those crucial moments, evolving from mere necessity into something more profound. As they faced the daunting journey to the cabin, their survival depended on a delicate dance of mutual understanding and trust. Jack's veterinary instincts warred with his human caution as he approached Echo. The foal was barely conscious, his wet coat already stiffening with ice. Dakota watched intently as Jack removed his partially frozen outer shirt, his fingers clumsy with cold as he tried to dry the colt's coat. Her ears remained focused on the bear's location, but her eyes never left Jack's movements. "We need to get him warm," Jack explained softly, knowing Dakota couldn't understand his words but recognizing she responded to his tone. The mare's intelligence continued to astound him as she positioned herself to block the worst of the wind, creating a small pocket of relative calm around her foal. Their forced cooperation revealed layers of shared experience neither could have anticipated. When Jack stumbled, his legs nearly numb from his time in the frozen lake, Dakota shifted her position to offer support, much as she would for an unsteady herd member. The gesture wasn't just instinctive, it showed a level of adaptation that challenged everything Jack thought he knew about wild horses. The bear's presence added urgency to their situation, but it also served as a catalyst for deepening their unlikely alliance. Dakota's protective instincts aligned perfectly with Jack's medical expertise, creating a seamless partnership born of necessity. She seemed to understand that his human knowledge complemented her natural abilities, especially when it came to helping Echo. As Jack worked to stimulate circulation in Echo's legs, he found himself talking more, sharing fragments of his past that he'd never voiced aloud. He told Dakota about Sarah, about the accident, about his choice to retreat from the world. The mare's ears flicked back and forth, her attention split between his voice and the surrounding dangers. But there was something therapeutic in the simple act of speaking to another living being who offered no judgment, only quiet presence. Their relationship developed its own language, a combination of subtle movements, soft sounds, and shared purpose. When Jack needed Dakota to move, he didn't grab for her or force compliance. Instead, he used gentle pressure points he'd learned in his veterinary work, and she responded with an understanding that went beyond mere training or instinct. The trust between them deepened when Jack realized Dakota was using her own body heat strategically. She would press close to Echo, then move away, encouraging the foal to seek warmth through movement. It was exactly what Jack would have prescribed, keeping the colt moving to prevent his muscles from seizing up. They were working in perfect synchronization, each contributing their unique strengths to Echo's survival. But perhaps the most significant development in their relationship came through shared vulnerability. Jack was as dependent on Dakota's natural instincts as she was on his human capabilities. When the bear's growls grew closer, it was Dakota's acute hearing that gave them precious seconds of warning. When Echo's condition began to deteriorate further, it was Jack's medical knowledge that identified the critical signs they couldn't ignore. Their partnership transcended the usual boundaries between wild and domestic, between human and horse. Dakota demonstrated an ability to adapt and problem-solve that challenged conventional understanding of wild horse behavior, and Jack, for the first time since Sarah's death, found himself fully present in the moment, his grief temporarily superseded by the immediate needs of others. As they prepared for the treacherous journey to the cabin, the relationship between man and mare had evolved into something unprecedented. They weren't just cooperating for survival, they were communicating on a level that defied explanation. Dakota's trust in Jack had grown from desperate necessity to calculated choice, while his respect for her intelligence had deepened into genuine awe. The storm raged on, and the bear's presence loomed ever closer. But in that small space between survival and understanding, something remarkable had taken root. The question was whether this newfound connection would be strong enough to get them through the challenges that still lay ahead. The relative calm shattered as a massive tree branch crashed down nearby, startling both horses and sending vibrations through the already unstable ice. Tripod the bear let out a roar that seemed to make the very air vibrate, much closer now than before. They were out of time. The decision to move had been made for them. Jack's medical training screamed at him about the dangers they faced. Echo's core temperature was dangerously low, his movements growing more sluggish by the minute. The foal needed immediate warming, but the 200-yard journey to the cabin might as well have been 200 miles given their current situation. The bear's presence meant they couldn't take the direct route through the trees, forcing them to stay in the more exposed area near the lake's edge. The storm intensified, driving sheets of ice, laid in snow horizontally across the lake. Visibility dropped to mere feet, creating a white wall that was both blessing and curse. It might hide them from the bear, but it also made navigation treacherous. Jack could barely make out his cabin's porch light through the maelstrom, a faint, flickering beacon that seemed to taunt them with its distance. Dakota's behavior changed suddenly, her muscles tensing as she caught a scent on the wind that Jack couldn't detect. The mare's reaction told him all he needed to know. Tripod was circling, using the storm as cover to flank them. The bear's hunting strategy revealed an intelligence that made it all the more dangerous, and able to chase down prey effectively with only 3 legs. It had learned to use weather and terrain to its advantage. Jack's own condition was deteriorating rapidly. His wet clothes had frozen into a rigid shell, making movement difficult and painful. Each breath felt like inhaling shards of glass, and the violent shivering that had racked his body earlier was beginning to subside, a dangerous sign of advancing hypothermia. He knew they had perhaps 15 minutes before his judgment would begin to fail. The conflict wasn't just external. Jack wrestled with memories of Sarah's accident, how the storm that day had come out of nowhere, just like this one. The parallel was almost too much to bear. Another desperate race against time, another life hanging in the balance. But this time, the outcome wasn't yet written. This time, he had a chance to change the ending. Echo stumbled, his legs buckling under him. The foal's eyes were starting to glaze over, consciousness slipping away as hypothermia tightened its grip. Dakota's distress was palpable as she nudged her baby, trying to keep him on his feet. But her attention was split as the bear's presence demanded vigilance, and she couldn't focus solely on her foal. Jack made a critical decision that went against every survival instinct he possessed. He removed his remaining outer layer, the last barrier between his skin and the lethal cold. Working quickly, he draped the frozen fabric over Echo's back. creating at least some protection from the wind. The cost was immediate and severe. The full force of the storm now tore at him unimpeded. Their situation deteriorated further as the ice beneath them began to shift and groan. The temperature drop had caused the lake to contract, creating new pressure points that threatened to shatter the surface. They were caught in an impossible position: move too quickly and risk breaking through the ice, move too slowly and succumb to cold or predator. The conflict reached a crescendo as multiple threats converged. A series of sharp cracks echoed across the lake as the ice began to fail. The bear's growls grew closer, now seemingly from multiple directions as the storm played tricks with sound. Echo's strength was failing rapidly, and Jack's vision began to blur as hypothermia clouded his thoughts. Dakota made a sound Jack had never heard before, not quite a whinny, not quite a scream. It was a call that seemed to carry both warning and determination, cutting through the storm's fury. The mare's muscles bunched beneath her frost-covered coat as she made a decision of her own, one that would either save them all or doom them completely. The next few seconds would determine everything: their survival, their trust, their future. The storm raged, the bear closed in, and the ice continued its ominous symphony of cracks and groans. They were out of options and out of time. Dakota's decision manifested in a surge of explosive movement. With strength born of desperation, she shouldered into Jack, forcing him closer to Echo. Her intent became clear in the next heart-stopping moment. She was positioning them together, creating a single unit she could defend. The timing proved crucial as Tripod burst from the storm's white curtain, a massive shadow of primal fury. The bear's awkward gait did nothing to diminish its terrifying presence. If anything, the obvious injury made it more dangerous, desperation having honed its hunting strategies to deadly efficiency. Jack's world narrowed to a series of fragmented, crystalline moments, the crack of ice spreading like spider webs beneath their feet, the steam of Dakota's breath freezing instantly in the air, Echo's pulse fluttering weakly beneath his frozen fingers, the bear's breath, visible in hot clouds as it closed the distance. Time seemed to stretch and compress, reality bending under the weight of their desperate circumstances. Dakota's response to the bear's charge defied both instinct and explanation. Instead of fleeing or attacking, she began to move in a precise pattern, her hooves striking the ice in a deliberate rhythm. The impacts sent vibrations through the frozen surface, creating a complex network of cracks that spread with mathematical precision. She was using the unstable ice as a weapon, forcing Tripod to adjust its charge or risk plunging into the lake. The bear, for all its cunning, couldn't process this unexpected strategy fast enough. Its momentum carried it onto the compromised ice, and the surface began to give way. But their victory was short-lived. The breaking ice didn't discriminate between predator and prey. The entire section of the lake's surface started to disintegrate. Jack's veterinary knowledge merged with pure survival instinct as he grabbed Echo's mane, using the last reserves of his strength to help the foal stay upright. The cold had become an entity unto itself, consuming thought and reason, leaving only the most basic imperative: move or die. Dakota's next action demonstrated an understanding of physics that should have been impossible for a wild horse. She began to move in a counterclockwise spiral, using centrifugal force to keep them on the rapidly diminishing solid ice while the surrounding surface crumbled. The bear's weight and awkward gait worked against it, forcing it to retreat or face submersion. But their escape route led them further from the cabin, away from their only chance for survival. The storm had reached its peak intensity, the wind now strong enough to physically push them across the ice. Visibility dropped to almost nothing, the cabin's light completely obscured by the white fury surrounding them. Jack's hypothermia reached a critical stage. His thoughts began to fragment, reality blurring at the edges. Sarah's voice seemed to whisper in the wind, and he couldn't tell if it was memory or hallucination. His grip on Echo's mane weakened, fingers no longer responding to commands from his frozen brain. That's when Dakota proved that trust, once given, could transcend species. She pressed her body against Jack's, sandwiching him between herself and Echo, using their combined body heat to keep him conscious. The position was awkward, making movement more difficult, but she maintained it with stubborn determination. Tripod hadn't given up. The bear had found more solid ice and was paralleling their movement, looking for another opportunity to attack. Its hunting strategy had evolved, showing an almost supernatural patience. It knew time was on its side. Its prey was weakening by the second. The climax came as a massive gust of wind swept across the lake, bringing with it a wall of snow and ice that momentarily blinded them all. In that instant of zero visibility, Tripod made its final charge. The bear's roar merged with the storm's howl, creating a sound that seemed to shake the very air. Dakota's response was immediate and devastating. She spun with impossible speed, placing herself between the bear and her charges. But instead of engaging, she reared up, her silhouette massive against the storm's fury. Her hooves struck the ice with calculated force, sending a spider web of cracks racing outward. The ice failed catastrophically, but with a precision that seemed almost planned. A section of the surface collapsed in a perfect circle around Tripod, while the area supporting Jack, Echo, and Dakota held firm. The bear plunged into the dark water with a roar of surprise and fury. In the chaos that followed, Dakota's focus never wavered. With Tripod temporarily neutralized, she began moving them toward where the cabin's light had last been visible. Each step was precisely placed, testing the ice before committing their weight. They were moving in what seemed like random patterns. But Jack's fading consciousness recognized the strategy. She was reading the ice's stability through vibrations, finding a safe path through touch alone. The storm's fury began to ease. Not in submission but in exhaustion, like a spent predator releasing its prey. Through the thinning curtain of snow, the cabin's light finally emerged, stronger now and steady. They had somehow curved back towards safety during Dakota's intricate ice dance, though none of them were in any condition to appreciate the feat. Jack's consciousness flickered like a candle in the wind, but Dakota wouldn't let him fade. Each time his awareness began to slip, she would bump him sharply with her shoulder. The impact just enough to jolt him back to reality. Her instincts had evolved beyond mere survival. She was actively managing the condition of both her charges, dividing her attention between Echo's faltering steps and Jack's dangerous lethargy. Echo had stopped shivering, his body conserving what little energy remained. The foal moved now only through his mother's constant encouragement, each step a battle against the cold that had settled deep in his bones. Jack's shirt, frozen solid on the colt's back, had at least provided some protection from the worst of the wind, but it wasn't enough to prevent the devastating effects of prolonged exposure. Behind them, they could hear Tripod's struggles as the bear fought to extract itself from the lake. The sound was growing fainter, whether because of distance or the bear's weakening condition. They couldn't be sure. The immediate threat had passed, but its absence only highlighted their own desperate race against time and temperature. The last 100 yards to the cabin became an exercise in mutual support. Dakota positioned herself so that both Jack and Echo could lean against her, creating a moving triangle that distributed their failing strength. Her own coat was rimed with ice, her muscles trembling with exhaustion, but she maintained their pace with unwavering determination. As they approached the cabin's porch, Jack's veterinary training surfaced through the hypothermic haze. The transition from cold to warmth would be critical. Too much heat too quickly could be as deadly as the cold itself. They would need to warm up gradually, carefully, or risk shock that could stop their hearts. But first, they had to make it inside. The 3 steps up to the porch might as well have been a mountain. Jack stumbled, his frozen legs refusing to lift high enough. Dakota's response was immediate and ingenious. She dropped her shoulder, effectively creating a ramp with her body. The movement was so smooth, so precisely calculated, that it seemed rehearsed rather than improvised. Echo went first, wobbling up his mother's makeshift ramp onto the porch. Jack followed, his movements mechanical, running on nothing but muscle memory and Dakota's constant guidance. The mare waited until they were both up before making her own ascent, her hooves clattering on the wooden boards with uncharacteristic clumsiness, the first real sign of how much the ordeal had taken out of her. The porch light illuminated their condition in stark detail. Ice covered them in layers, creating crystalline shells that caught and reflected the light. Steam rose from their bodies as the slightly warmer air began to work on the frozen layers, creating an otherworldly mist that swirled around them. They looked like creatures from some winter fairy tale, transformed by their journey through the storm. Jack's hands shook violently as he tried to work the cabin's door latch. Dakota watched intently, and in a moment that would later seem dreamlike, she reached out with her muzzle and pressed down on the handle herself. The door swung open, releasing a wave of warm air that felt almost solid after the storm's bitter cold. The threshold represented more than just shelter. It was a boundary between wild and domestic, between desperation and safety. Dakota's hesitation was brief but noticeable. her wild instincts warring with necessity, but Echo's need outweighed her natural caution. And after a moment's consideration, she followed them into the cabin's warmth. The cabin's interior emerged from darkness as Jack managed to hit the light switch with numb fingers. The sudden illumination revealed a space that would become their sanctuary for the next crucial hours. The main room was modest but practical. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, while thick rugs covered most of the wooden floor. A large couch and several chairs created a natural gathering space, their worn comfort a stark contrast to the brutal conditions outside. Dakota's entrance was a study in controlled power. Despite her exhaustion, she moved with deliberate care, testing each floorboard before committing her weight. Her hooves, designed for rough terrain, clicked softly against the wood as she guided Echo toward the fireplace. The foal's movements were becoming more erratic, his coordination failing as hypothermia tightened its grip. Jack's medical training fought through his own deteriorating condition. The next few minutes would be critical for all their survival. Too much heat too quickly could send them into shock, but they needed to raise their core temperatures before organ failure became a real possibility. His hands shook violently as he worked to start a fire, muscle memory taking over where conscious thought failed. The fireplace came to life with a whoosh, the dry wood catching quickly. Jack had maintained the cabin meticulously despite his isolation, and that preparation was now paying dividends. The heat began to build gradually, exactly as needed. He pulled several thick blankets from a chest, his movements clumsy but purposeful. Dakota's behavior continued to defy conventional understanding of wild horses. She positioned Echo close enough to the fire for warmth but not so near as to risk shock from rapid temperature change. Then, remarkably, she began to groom her foal with her teeth, removing ice and stimulating circulation just as effectively as any human massage could have done. Jack's veterinary supplies were stored in a cabinet near the kitchen. He stumbled toward them, fighting the darkness that threatened to overtake his vision. The familiar organization of the medical kit anchored him, giving his thoughts something to focus on besides the cold that had settled into his bones. He pulled out what they would need: thermometers, warming fluids, and emergency medications. The next hour passed in a blur of careful monitoring and gradual warming. Jack moved on autopilot, his medical training superseding his body's demands for rest. He checked Echo's temperature every 15 minutes, administered warm fluids subcutaneously, and massaged the foal's legs to prevent muscle damage. Dakota watched every procedure with intense focus, seeming to memorize each action. The mare's own condition required attention, but she refused to let Jack examine her until he had seen to Echo and taken care of himself. Her maternal instincts had expanded to include Jack in their protective sphere, and she demonstrated this by physically blocking him from doing any more work until he had changed into dry clothes and wrapped himself in blankets. As their core temperatures slowly rose, the full impact of their shared ordeal began to manifest in unexpected ways. Dakota, despite her wild nature, showed no inclination to leave once Echo was stable. Instead, she settled herself between the foal and the door, creating a protective barrier that served multiple purposes. She could monitor both her cold and any potential threats while sharing her body heat with her offspring. The storm continued its assault outside, but its fury felt distant now, muffled by the cabin's solid walls. The contrast between the chaos they had escaped and their current sanctuary was profound. The firelight cast dancing shadows on the walls, creating an almost dreamlike atmosphere that seemed to exist outside of normal time. Jack's medical checks became less frequent as Echo's condition stabilized. The foal's temperature had risen to safer levels, and his shivering had taken on the healthy pattern of normal thermoregulation. Dakota's grooming had restored circulation to his coat, which was now almost dry thanks to the fire's steady warmth. The adrenaline that had kept Jack functioning began to ebb, leaving him drained but clear-headed. He settled into his favorite chair, position where he could monitor both horses while still staying warm by the fire. Dakota's eyes met his, and in that moment of shared exhaustion and relief, something shifted in their relationship. They had moved beyond their roles as wild horse and human, beyond even the partnership of their survival. They had become something else entirely, something for which Jack had no words. The night deepened as the storm gradually spent itself, its fury dissolving into sporadic gusts that rattled the cabin's windows. Inside, the transformation of the space was remarkable. What had started as an emergency shelter had evolved into something that felt almost sacred, a place where the boundaries between wild and tame, human and animal, had blurred into meaninglessness. Echo had fallen into the deep sleep of recovery, his breathing steady and strong. The foal's position near the fireplace allowed the warmth to reach him in gentle waves, while Dakota's body blocked any drafts from the door. His coat, now dry and fluffy, shifted slightly with each breath, providing visible proof of his improving condition. Dakota maintained her vigil, but her posture had softened. She allowed herself brief periods of rest, her head dropping slightly before snapping back up to scan the room. Each time her eyes met Jack's, there was a deepening of understanding between them. They had moved beyond their initial roles of rescuer and rescued, beyond even their shared ordeal in the storm. Something profound had shifted in their relationship, something that defied easy classification. Jack's medical training provided a framework for understanding their physical recovery, but it offered no insight into the psychological changes taking place. His isolation following Sarah's death had been a self-imposed exile, a withdrawal from the complexities of human interaction. Yet here he was, forming a connection that was simultaneously simpler and more complex than anything he had experienced before. The fire needed periodic tending, and each time Jack rose to add wood, Dakota watched with intelligent interest. She seemed to be mapping the relationship between his actions and the resulting warmth, adding this knowledge to what was becoming an impressive understanding of human behavior. Her adaptability was remarkable. She had transitioned from wild survival to domestic cooperation in a matter of hours, driven by necessity but guided by an intelligence that challenged conventional understanding of equine behavior. As the night wore on, Jack found himself talking softly, sharing stories with Dakota. He told her about Sarah, about the accident that had driven him to this remote cabin, about the guilt and grief that had become his constant companions. Dakota's ears flicked back and forth as she listened, her eyes never leaving his face. There was no judgment in her gaze, no expectation of response or resolution. She simply witnessed his pain, offering a presence that was somehow more healing than any human consolation had been. The storm's withdrawal revealed a transformed world outside. Moonlight broke through the clearing clouds, casting silver light on the new-fallen snow. The lake's surface, visible through the cabin's windows, showed the evidence of their desperate crossing, the chaotic pattern of broken ice and refrozen water that told the story of their survival. Echo stirred in his sleep, his legs twitching as he perhaps relived their journey in dreams. Dakota immediately turned her attention to him, nickering softly until he settled again. Her mothering instincts had never wavered, but they had expanded to include an awareness of human medical care that suggested an extraordinary capacity for learning and adaptation. Jack checked his watch, surprised to find that only a few hours had passed since their arrival at the cabin. Time had taken on a different quality, marked not by minutes and hours but by the rhythm of breathing, the crackling of the fire, the periodic checks of temperature and vital signs. They had created their own temporal space, one that operated according to the needs of healing rather than the arbitrary divisions of clock time. The night ahead would require continued vigilance, but the immediate crisis had passed. They had all three survived not just through luck or skill, but through a combination of trust, intelligence, and a connection that transcended species. As Jack settled back into his chair, Dakota's steady gaze met his once more, and he realized that while they had entered the cabin as three separate beings, they would leave it as something else entirely, a new kind of family, forged in ice and fire, bound by something deeper than blood or circumstance.